So it starts here for Newcastle United pre-season 2025. The first public friendly. 10,000 Newcastle fans will be here today to see if Newcastle can make that winning start to pre-season. I think really everyone's looking forward to seeing Anthony Elanga playing, but this will be a tough test against Celtic. Celtic beat Sporting Lisbon 2-0 the other night in the Algarve. They're a little bit ahead of Newcastle United, so yeah, tough test against the Scottish Premiership champions. I think really now for Eddie Howe, he just wants to make sure that Newcastle can start some momentum, get it going, and avoid those key injuries which hamstrung Newcastle last season. As I say, huge following here today from Newcastle. People leaving the city centre very early this morning. 10,000. It's a lot more than your average away game. A real opportunity to see Newcastle at this very famous stadium here in Glasgow. So hopefully Newcastle can get off to a good start today. Results aren't important in pre-season, of course, but really in terms of setting the tone, that's what Eddie Howe will be after. But it has been a long week in Austria. Eddie said only the other day that the players could be a little bit jaded, so they're going to have to really give it a go against Celtic today, but hopefully a big opportunity for Newcastle here in Glasgow. So Newcastle have lost 4-0 here at Celtic in a pre-season friendly, the Adidas Cup, and yeah, there was only one team that really seemed at it here today. And let's get everything into perspective first and foremost. Newcastle are at least 2 weeks behind Celtic in terms of their preparations. So yeah, I mean, Celtic only 2 weeks away from their opening game here against St Mirren on August the 3rd. But I think really for Newcastle, while it was pre-season, while they really have only just been back over a week or so, I think realistically there were some issues in this game for me, which we're not going to dance around. I think you've got to be totally honest and say, Newcastle should not be losing 4-0 to Celtic, and the Champions League is just around the corner. Celtic are a team that are not going to win the Champions League. There's no doubt about that. And Newcastle were a long way behind them today. So yeah, the issues for me, I mean, first and foremost, the main issue was the fact Alexander Isak not playing. Don't have so much of a problem with that, but obviously I will come on to that very soon. It was the fact that they didn't have any real replacements for Alexander Isak today. Will Asula stepped in and had his opportunity, and he did create chances, and he was a threat. But Newcastle didn't really look like scoring too often in this game, and obviously couldn't even get a consolation goal. So yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm complaining about losing the pre-season friendly, but the lack of attacking options, the lack of strikers Newcastle have on the books, is a big worry, and there's no real escaping from that. Now, the other big issue Newcastle have got really is they've only got one pre-season signing through the door in Anthony Elanga, the £55 million man. He came on in the second half, and yeah, he looked good. Don't get me wrong. When Newcastle offered him the ball, he did cause a few problems, and I think it's a great signing, and I think things will only get better from that point of view. But then defensively, Newcastle today, do they need another centre back? It really does feel like they do. Sven Botman looked way short of fitness. Fabian Schär didn't have his best game. 2 gift goals. If you look at giving the penalty away, Joe Willock, and then obviously the goal where Nick Pope sprinted out, goes over his head, and it's a tap in for Kenny, 2-0. And then the second half, again, even though Celtic made a lot of changes, Newcastle was still second best. And again, keeping it in context, it was a friendly. It won't matter at the end of the day, but there were some takeaways from it. There were some issues from it, and Newcastle will have to improve that. And the level of opposition doesn't get much easier in pre-season. They've got Arsenal and Tottenham to come with a game against the K-League 11, sort of in the middle of those two matches in the Far East. And, again, it's going to be a hard workout for Newcastle. The training over there will be in, those steaming conditions, and it's going to be tough for Newcastle. But as long as it's all right against Aston Villa, that's probably all I care about. That's probably all you care about. It's all Eddie Howe cares about. He said that in his press conference to us just then. He was quite relaxed about things. He said on Isak, there's no injury problem, but he felt it was probably better to send him home after Austria. He didn't want him just sat in the stands today. It calls the story the fact he wasn't on the team sheet. It was quickly rectified why he wasn't, because Eddie Howe wants to manage Isak's minutes, and he also said that he would be on the plane that leaves for the Far East towards the end of next week. So it doesn't feel like there's any alarm bells on that one at the moment. Eddie was asked, had there been a formal approach for Isak, and he said no, there's been no approach. Speculation, yes. Formal approach, no. No bid. And no issue as far as Eddie Howe's concerned. But he was also very honest with some of the things he said. He said, that he can never sit there with full clarity and say a player will not be sold. He can't do that. And, he said that at the end of last season as well, if you remember. He said it in May, that Newcastle, are a club that they can't guarantee that the top players will stay. He said in there that Newcastle's wages compared to some of the bigger hitters in the Premier League they're not as high because the revenue isn't as high. We still have the PSR issue. So ultimately for Newcastle fans, you're in this situation where Newcastle have got some big hitters in the squad, but moving forward, one of them may have to be sold. Whether it's this summer, whether it's in January, whether it's next summer, and then the money gets reinvested, we'll have to wait and see. But Eddie Howe could not guarantee that Alexander Isak will definitely stay at Newcastle. I think that was telling. But he said at the moment, he is still Newcastle's player. One of the other things that I noticed in the press conference was he says he thinks he'll be here at the start of the season. Start of the season is a bit different to end of the window, which is where you want to see Newcastle with the best players still on board. So, yeah, I'm standing here now. I don't think there's any real reason to panic. Do I think a sale is imminent? No, not just on what I've been told there. But yeah, it was a disappointing day for Newcastle overall. Just a quick one on the fans. 10,000 fans here today making great noise despite a 4-0 defeat. Chanting, "We'll love you evermore" to the Newcastle players as they went over to applaud them at the end. Eddie Howe demanding they went over. I said, come on, let's go over. And yeah, I mean, some of the fans obviously, came here today probably like me, not expecting to see, vintage stuff. Who does in pre-season? We've seen it down the years. Newcastle losing a lot of pre-season games. Doesn't matter. Newcastle had a fantastic season last year, and pre-season had its issues. So, let's not get carried away. 4-0 at Celtic, yeah, we don't want to be enduring results like that, but I think sometimes you learn more in defeat. I think certainly I learned a lot more about this Newcastle squad today than I would if they'd won 4-0. That, might sound a bit obvious, but at the end of the day, Newcastle supporters will feel today that, it was pre-season and, they move on and, it's sadly, these days can get built up because you've waited so long to see your team again. You've waited so long for an away trip, and the end result is disappointing. But yeah, let's not read too much into it. There's going to be bigger and harder tests to come as we move on to what we call the real stuff. And as I said earlier, Newcastle were a couple of weeks behind Celtic. So yeah, this was you know the scoreline. I've seen some of the things said on social media, but I don't really read too much into it. And I think realistically now, Newcastle move on to the Far East. It'll be hard work, but as long as they beat Aston Villa on the first game of the season, that's got to be all that counts. By then, I would like to think Newcastle have signed another goalkeeper. I'd like to think they've signed another centre back. I'd like to think Isak's situation has settled down. I'd like to think they've got another forward on the books. I'd love to see 3 more players signed on top of Anthony Elanga before that game against Aston Villa starts. If not, I'd like to see it before the window shuts, and I'd like to see Isak stay here. So there's a lot of things we all desire, and there's a lot of things we know need to happen in order for Newcastle to have a successful season. The squad is, they played pretty much 2 11s today, but proved not enough really. Second half probably a little bit better, but still some of the same problems. But I think ultimately to lose 4-0 to Celtic is not a result you want on your pre-season results. And Newcastle must dust themselves down, move on to the Far East, and hope that there's going to be some more positive things to say than this afternoon. But look, no panic. No panic on Isak, no panic on the result, but a disappointing result, yes. End of the world, probably not.